All right. Hey, Joe. Hi. Hi, Ben.
How
Yeah.
are you
No, I
doing?
think, yeah, one thing I wanted to mention was like, I think there's been a trend among podcasters to basically just show how the sausage is made. Um, it makes for like some decent content. And if nothing else, you sort of feel like, you feel like these are real people, just kind of working it
Hmm.
out. And like, no one's going to watch the first couple episodes anyway. So I figure I might as well just make
Time
some
goes
content
on,
with it.
content
Yeah.
creation becomes more and more meta.
Yeah. It'll be, and it'd be fun if nothing else for us to go back and like see if this thing, does work out. We can go back and see our humble beginnings, have it
Yeah,
on record.
exactly. This is going to be the highly sought after origin story pieces.
Yeah, exactly. We
Whenever
need to
we have
document
like
our
a
origins.
documentary made about us later.
We need to if we end up just making it ourselves, we'll have to, yeah, look back fondly to where this thing all started. But yeah, I thought we could even just start each episode with like banter or like some sort of cold open or just a catch up.
Right.
I can go first. I think it's just gonna be. I think mine's gonna be pretty quick.
I
Show
think
you what I
mine
got
will
for
be
this
as
week.
well.
Yeah. Okay, that's fine. I know I have a question. So I got a camera set up. Hopefully this is like a better quality here. I got a camera set up like it's a proper DSLR camera that I was managed
Oh,
to
really?
work out to become a webcam. Yeah, because I didn't want to buy another webcam. I had another one that was better quality, but the field of view was just insane. It was like 120. So everything above us, you can actually
Hmm.
see, you can almost see the entire wall because it was such like
Oh,
a
really?
fisheye view. Yeah. So I got this thing working, but it's not plugged into anything. It's not, it doesn't have a direct power connection. So it's just battery and I don't know how long it's going to last. So if I drop off, that's why the camera died. So that's going to be one experiment I know now. But anyway, um, let me share my screen. So um, yeah, the thing that we talked about that I would do today would be basically sort of some analysis around that 25,000. Um, Here's the proposal. Basically, a federal assistant for first-time homebuyers. They're going to offer for 4 million first-time buyers. I guess over the next 4 years, they would get some, down payment assistance. And the average, and this maybe is a critical point, the average is going to be like 25,000. That's going to be offered. So we're talking 4 million people, 25,000 average. I guess they budgeted something like 100 billion for this program. So I wanted to kind of take a look at this. The first thing that prompted me to look into this had to do with some of the claims that showed up on Twitter or X around, okay, all this means is that home prices are going to go up by 25,000. But if you think about it, and I'll walk you through here, that it's actually arguably a lot more. So just to kind of walk you through what I got here, it's starting off. Let's just assume you got a salary of 100,000, and now we got two different approaches here. One is without what I'm calling the Harris help, and that's going to say you've got 30,000 saved up yourself. So that's what this 30,000 is, and then Harris is
Okay.
going to come in and give you another 25,000. So now the total
The
money you have
Harris help.
available, yeah, the Harris help. Total amount of money that you have available with their help would be 55 grand, and without it, it'd be 30 grand. And now you got to assume you have a down payment of, usually it's like, I think it's like 10% minimum.
Hmm.
And maybe some banks, depending on your credit quality or something, will demand 20% down
Yeah.
so that they can get
Depending
up
on
there.
part of the country and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, it's a couple of things. I'm thinking back to how much we put down. I'm a proud homeowner myself, and I think it was 10%. I know it was 10%. I know how much the value of the house was worth, and I know how much we put down. So it was 10%. Now that means if you get with Harris's help, you're able to afford, even though you've only saved up 30 grand, you can afford a house of about 550,000. Whereas, you would only, without our help, you would only be able to afford about 300 grand. Now that means that you're, potentially the amount of purchasing power that you just got was not 25 grand, but 10 times that amount is going to be a function of the down payment, 10%. So,
Right.
the kind of analysis that you already see online, arguably is wrong by like an order of magnitude, by like 10x, because you're essentially, by giving them money before the down payment, you're kind of offering them up like a levered transaction in a way. Um, so
Yeah, I
that
mean,
was
if
one thing.
it's if oh yeah, I was just going to comment. Yeah, if what you're giving out to people is something that's going to be levered by definition, the price impact is not going to be just that flat amount of
It's
the
not going to be that flat
pre-leverage
amount.
level.
Yeah. So then you kind of are like, all right, so that's kind of point one. But then you can kind of game this out. You can take it to the next step and just be like, okay, what sort of impact might this have? What's kind of the next potential bottleneck that a home buyer is going to run into? And that's when you start getting into kind of the other thing that banks will look at when they want to assess if you're going to be a good credit, if you're going to like be able to pay back this loan. And that's going to be, they're going to ask essentially for what how much debt you currently have. And they're probably going to have some assumptions around your expenses. But ultimately, what they want to be able to see and what you need to demonstrate to the bank is that you're going to be able to make the monthly payment every month. So that's kind of the next bottleneck that I kind of foresee potential buyers in this program going to be running up against. So we have a couple basic sort of details here. The interest rate. I think I looked it up. It's about 6.5 national.
Right.
Although arguably, it might be higher. We could
Yeah,
take this up
it's
to 7%. Yeah, what is it actually? You probably know.
yeah, it was at right around 7 at the peak, but it started to settle down a little bit just given like rate cut expectations and all that sort of stuff. Yes,
Okay.
I think mid sixes is roughly where it's been.
All right. Let's stick to 6.5 then. Now we're gonna get like a 30-year mortgage. That's pretty standard. And you can kind of just tease out that just based on this, we're looking at a monthly payment with Harris's help. So again, you're buying a more expensive house. So the loan amount, is going to be more. Again, you're now
Hmm.
paying 90% of the value of the house, and that's going to be close to 500 grand. Monthly payment will come out above 3,000. Whereas before you could only afford a house of 300 grand, but you're going to be paying a little more than half that, so like 1,700.
Hmm.
So like let's tease this out.
That's
Um,
a really substantial difference in monthly payments.
Yeah. And that's what I'm saying. I think that's probably where, fine, you can get enough money for the down payment, but it doesn't mean you can automatically just afford the house necessarily. And I think
Right.
when you talk about buying a house, really you're not limited so much by the down payment, usually. You're limited,
Right.
because you can also get some help. A lot of people can be able to scrape around some things that they need. Maybe a family member or something will help.
Hmm.
But a lot of times you're saving. Like I know when we bought this house, I was saving for a while. And, usually you're buying a house maybe with someone else and they have some money saved. And the issue then becomes really, can I afford this in the sense, can I afford the mortgage every month?
For the next
When you,
30 years.
for the next 30 years. So let's look at this one again. We're looking at somebody. So I made a very basic budget, for like a potential household. Like I said, so the monthly payment, this is going to be the mortgage payment down here. And that's going to be
Hmm.
over 3,000. Let's call it 3,100. Um, there are what a lot of people don't understand. There's a lot of costs associated with having a house, including you got a property tax, which I think is one of the biggest sets of BS on the planet. It's the property tax. That's when people start complaining. Not to get on a soapbox too much. Yeah, but like you're paying
Hey,
tax on
that's
something.
what we're here for.
That's what we're here for. Yeah, but you're paying you're paying tax on something you already own. Um,
Right.
anyway, but that can be substantial. And I think when we were looking for houses once in New Jersey, and New Jersey property tax was like 2.5%, and that 2.5% is on the value of the house,
That's
value of the
absurd.
house that you got to pay every year, and they kind of fold
Hmm.
that in with the mortgage. This right here is just 1%, and we're at $460. But if we were to take this
Wow.
to like 2.5%, you're paying over $1,000 a month just in
Almost
taxes.
just indefinitely.
it is outrage. It is so frustrating because it impacts what you can afford
Twelve
too.
hundred
Because you
dollars a
gotta,
month indefinitely. That is
yeah,
wow.
yeah. Again, don't get me started, but it's like
No, come on, you got to start.
it's a real kick in the pants. It's brutal.
Yeah,
Um, but anyway,
it almost makes
let's
you
call it
wonder
one
what's the
percent.
trade off between giving tax or some assistance for a down payment and say, well, why don't you just lower my property tax instead?
Yeah, I mean that's probably, but that's okay. And again, we don't want to betray too much of our political leanings, but like, maybe we do. We just want to be truthful here. It's antithetical
Yeah.
to somehow
Hmm.
lower the amount of money coming into the federal government. I think to certain political
I
parties.
mean, I also think it's just simple messaging, right? People don't want to hear, "Oh, I'm going to decrease your property taxes." They want to
Yeah,
hear, "I'm going to give you $25,000." That
right.
sounds way better.
That's a good point. That's a really good point. That's much easier to sell than we're already like 15 minutes into this podcast, and I'm like just kind of explaining how property taxes work and what how much they're gonna cost. You can't
Right.
fit that on a billboard.
Yeah.
But anyway, so let's say that you have 100,000 salary. So that means your monthly gross is going to be about 8,300, and then we can start going through taxes, and then pre-tax and post-tax deductions. So anyone who's kind of familiar and have decided to take a look at what their paycheck looks like, I pulled some numbers from this website. It's a paycheck calculator, and so they're what gave me sort of the taxes you can expect when you make 100,000 in Massachusetts.
Hmm.
And so we're talking like 17%, for sort of like federal, 7, I guess, 0.19 state and some other stuff. Then you get some pre-tax deductions. So maybe you got to pay for medical insurance. That's the biggest one. And I put 250 here. That's, I guess, if you're living alone. If you got a family though, it's easily twice that. And then
Easily.
post tax deductions. So you're like 401k. Say you put it into like a post tax version of the 401k. So in one month, you might have, you know, call it $5,900 after your $8,300 paycheck gets taxed and everything.
Hmm.
So now your mortgage comes in at 3,000, right? So now you're left with about $2,800 for everything else, and you got to eat.
Hmm.
It's like 1,000. Your car got to eat. Car's thirsty, right? She needs some gas.
And
You got to put aside maybe 300 because there's stuff breaks around the house. That's
yeah,
once every 6 months or something. You easily can pay over $1,000 to fix something around the house.
definitely.
That diploma. So you're talking about school loans, 600. This is like personal experience. A lot of this is. It's a
Hmm.
cheap car, 400 for the car loan. Utilities, staying warm. Property taxes. That's where this is going to get folded in.
Oh,
Um,
geez. Yeah.
Homeowners insurance that comes in, and then staying decent. So sometimes you got to buy clothes, and you know you got to get Listerine, stuff like that. So now all of a
If you
sudden
can
you're
afford
already,
clothing and all of your
yeah,
living
if you want to
necessities
buy
on $100
clothes,
a month, that's
yeah.
already very, very conservative.
So, you're already in the negative. You can't afford that, basically. And,
Yeah, I mean,
maybe
and
you'll,
like that even
maybe,
seems conservative in what those numbers are. It's you're just way out of there.
yeah. I mean, so, then let's start punching in some other numbers. I'm going to move you over here and I'm going to punch in some other numbers. So now let's say if instead of,
And it's also
the
kind
amount,
of funny, sorry, by the way, it's like just seeing how quickly that salary is just gone. Like that salary and then some is just totally gone. People used to say that. I mean, is there still a conception that, oh, I make six figures, is making $100,000 a year? Does that like that value really has changed quite a bit? It seems like even 5 years ago, that sounded like, oh, that's, kind of a weighty number. You're doing pretty good for yourself. And
yeah.
now it's like you break this down and you see it's just barely goes anywhere anymore. So, That
Yeah.
also kind of leads into our next topic about inflation, but we'll we'll leave that aside for the time being.
Yeah. Um, so let's just start, gaming some of this stuff out. How expensive of a house could we afford? Just kind of based on these assumptions here at 100,000. Um,
Hmm. Just kind of back solve
and
this thing.
Yeah, so right now we're looking at 20,000. Let's zoom out. I don't know if can you still see this?
Yeah.
Um, so let's put in, 10, so there you go. So you could
Hmm.
probably afford, instead of saving up sort of what you had before, you could, maybe buy a house that's 350,000. So even with this help, it doesn't necessarily mean you can afford quote unquote a house that is worth, what were we saying before? 550,000. You really still can't afford a
Hmm.
550,000 house, even though you can afford the down payment. You're still stuck with
Right.
something like a right. So I think that would probably be the bottleneck. So that's kind of the second point. You're still running into bottlenecks, even though you have this 25K coming in from Harris. I think, if we wanted to take the next step, which is to say, like, okay, this is all well and good, but the other big factor here is we were sort of at the top of what we think the sort of the rate curve going to be. So everyone is kind of expecting, and this is extremely topical. It's going to happen within the next week, whether or not the Fed is going to cut. And if they cut, then they're usually going to keep cutting, which means this interest rate over here, this number is going to start going down. Now, I think before, when rates were at zero, you can get a good mortgage for like 3.5%. So let's kind of look at what the other. Let's punch in these numbers again. Okay. So now, if we have an interest rate at 3.5%, um, now with the same money that you'd save for the down payment initially, remember that 30 grand, and you had interest
Hmm.
rates at 3.5%. Now all of a sudden, your monthly payment is no longer that 3,100 number. It's cut by almost $900, which is going to get you almost to something you can afford. So, you know, the other rub here is, okay, so maybe right now, because interest rates are so high, if they rolled out this program, it wouldn't necessarily have a huge impact because people are still going to be limited in what they can afford. But if in like a year from now this program is still going on, then I think it's really going to start to pick up. I think that's probably when the biggest increase to sort of demand in the housing market is going to happen. Not just when this program rolls out, but once this program rolls out and interest rates go back down. So anyway, that's kind of those are my sort of takeaways. Um, First off, it's a leverage transaction. Prices just based on their approach to the analysis isn't going to go up 25,000. It's going to go up 250,000. But I think there's still going to be a big bottleneck for first-time homeowners, and that's just going to be the monthly payment when interest rates are this high. So when interest rates come down, then I think you would probably see a big shoot in demand for the housing market. Um, and then I'll just give my own personal opinion about this policy. I strongly oppose it, only because it's just more free money from the government, and we can't afford it. Maybe if this was a serious issue and we had the room and we could afford it, but we can't. Spending another 100 billion that the U.S. Treasury doesn't have, I think, is as responsible, if not more irresponsible, as it is buying a house that you can't afford. But
Yeah,
but
certainly, and it's a really tough spot we're in today because $100 billion, that's a huge number, but the yearly deficit is, I think, nearly $2 trillion now, every year.
yeah,
So in
I'll
that
mention that
sense, yeah, like it's almost easy for politicians to say, "Oh, this is a relatively small amount of the deficit."
it's bonkers. I mentioned before how like I wanted to start looking into the budget, sort of as in the future for future episodes. I started doing
Hmm.
that actually yesterday, and man, the more you look into it, the more upset I get. So I don't know if I don't know if this is going
No,
to work
that
out.
should definitely be another episode because it is quite strange right now about not only just how large the deficit is and the trajectory of spending and all those
Yeah,
things, but I think what's most striking, as of today, is that there's usually some differentiation between political parties in their attitudes towards this,
yeah,
at least what they're saying about the campaign trail. Now you've got both sides who, presumably are quite different in terms of what they
yeah,
represent politically, but they're doing the same thing, just spend more. It feels like a
yeah,
very cheap way of just everyone's just trying to get voters, vote for me, I'll give you 25K for the house. I
yeah,
won't tax your tips. Now I'm not going to tax your overtime. Whoever you are, it's just all of the new ideas are just more spending, and whether it's a reduction of federal income or an increase in federal expenditures,
yeah.
they're all having the same
It's
effect.
yeah. At least yeah. At some point, the Republicans pretended, at the very least, to
Right.
be the government, the fiscally conservative and responsible one. Trump maybe blew a hole in that. I didn't necessarily get that sense, but the
Yeah,
Democrats
I think
absolutely are not.
I think a lot of it is even beyond politics as well, because two of the main levers to what the level of debt is in this country, I would argue, is also heavily influenced by the monetary supply. And so and that's where the Federal uh, Reserve comes into play. And you ask yourself, how did this start happening? How did this kind of, like, you
Mhm.
look at a chart of the total national debt over time, and I think the size of the treasury market today is in the high 20 trillions. And, even back at uh, pre 2008, I think it was like a few trillion. It was less than 10 for sure. So you had these two events at the beginning of the century that's really kind of blew the top off twice. It was the Great Recession, and then trillions of dollars of spending in the aftermath of that. And then just as soon as we were starting to try to roll some of that back, then COVID occurred. And it's like no one
Yeah,
could have seen that coming in any way. And it just happened again. So now we're kind of
yeah.
accustomed to just spending more and more,
It
and we haven't seen any negative effects yet necessarily. We've begun to, but and I think that actually leads us into our next topic.
yeah, the inflation. Yeah, let's talk. You mentioned you were going to talk about inflation. I'll just say like kind of one thing. It seems like every time there's a crisis, the solution it just seems to be an excuse for government to spend more, even when the crisis is inflation, in which the
Hmm.
problem was overspending. They just spent more. Like the Inflation Reduction Act.
Right.
I think we could do a segment. Maybe I'll do a segment on
That
that.
one is very
Is
strange.
it is so insulting, because they just think, look, if we just call it this, our
It's absurd.
our yeah our stupid citizenry will think that that's what it does, when in fact it's really just a huge spending bill for um,
And how
clean
can't you think
energy,
that? If that's
clean
what you're
energy.
telling
That's
millions
what
of
it's
people, that's what it
called,
is.
and it's just a big and yeah. Anyway,
And the absurdity is even better because even President Biden himself, I think this past week or just recently, was quoted on the record saying it would have been more ideal to name it something else or
yeah. Oh,
something
that's
like
right.
that.
I think I did see that.
Like
It's just insulting.
fully admitting that it's a
Yeah,
lie. I don't
it's a
know.
lie.
Bad
It's
messaging
just
versus a lie, whatever you want to
exactly.
call it.
And like I called it when he said like years ago or whatever, we're going to do this Inflation Reduction Act, and then that's not going to have anything to do. The Fed does the inflation, handles the inflation, but then
Right.
nevertheless, when it does come down eventually, and it will, Biden will take credit for it, and that's exactly what happened. And it was just
Right.
it was insulting. Um, anyway,
That's
inflation.
politics. Right.
Uh,
Okay. Yeah. So with inflation, very topical. I still will chat a little bit, but mostly here in this first episode, I wanted to give just a little bit of background. And to be honest, as I was looking this up, I think there's a lot of definitional items that are really helpful to kind of lay out and just kind of understand exactly how these things are constructed. Because whenever people talk about inflation, it's a very broad term, you know. It's not exactly, and then people then start throwing out numbers about it. How high was it now versus how high was it then? How is it move? How does this compare to previous historical periods where we saw inflation? What were the aftermath of those kinds of situations at what levels, and we look at the levels today, and you try to draw conclusions about, what can happen from there. So it's all a very, very difficult topic to talk about, or to like rigorously analyze and think about. So um, I just wanted to take a few minutes to kind of back up and I guess talk about just start at the beginning. Like what is inflation? Like how did this happen? What like we now in the United States, and I think across, well, pretty much globally after the pandemic, most countries have seen this broad increase in inflation. So what is inflation? Like what does that mean? So if you open up any economics textbook 101, it's broadly or simply stated when the prices of goods and services rise in an economy. So, but what does that mean? Because prices can rise for a lot of different reasons. You can come out with a new iPad that's twice as big or twice as good. It's, the price is going to increase. You could, a new restaurant could hit town that's, 1.5 times the price of the one next door. Why is that? Oh, because they have better ingredients. They've got a better chef. Who knows? But inflation is, or so, but what happens whenever prices increase without any kind of fundamental change to the underlying thing that's being sold? Prices are just rising just for the sake of it. That's kind of what people, simply stated, people are referring to whenever they think about inflation. It's this broad increase in prices across the economy, across goods and services, with no fundamental change, across every good and service in the economy. Just things are rising overall. And so uh, that's really um, uh, so obviously that can be a large issue whenever prices are rising, but you're not getting any more for what you're buying. And so if your incomes aren't increasing at the same time, so obviously now you just can't afford as many goods and services as you could before. So that's like what the economists call this erosion of spending power. So then you think about, well, how can we combat this? So, what happens? And, you could think about raising incomes. And once you could do that, then you can keep up with those price increases. But then the issue is if people are anticipating more price increases, it's better to spend today than tomorrow. So then people will start spending more. And then others are incentivized to spend more because they think their neighbor is going to spend more, and then they ask for more income increases, or you look for a new job that's going to pay you more, or you ask your boss to get paid more, and then you've got this very negative feedback loop where you're asking for more money to be able to buy things, but then the things you're trying to buy increase even more, and then you get this runaway inflation effect. So that's something that has happened in the past, and particularly in the 1970s, it was very damaging to the economy in America. And that was really something that I was going to say politicians, but more so the Federal Reserve has really tried to learn as much as they could from during this round of inflation. So and so we're really at the precipice right now of seeing how effective this whole rate hiking campaign has been so far, as we're so the next FOMC meeting is next week, and they're very likely going to begin lowering rates. And so it'll be a very big watch point to see if inflation will truly stay down from that point, or it could start
Do you think?
increasing again.
Do you
And
think they're
this,
going to cut?
yeah, I mean, they're very likely going to cut, and there's a lot of reasons for that. But so one of the reasons you can ask yourself, so why would they be ready to cut right now? And so
Yeah,
one
it's
one of the
not. I
primary
mean, let's
reasons is because
just like set the scene here, though. I mean, don't they say that they're targeting 2%, but they're not at 2% yet? They're only at like I think 3 or something. Didn't it tick up a little bit too? Kind of the
right. So that's
last
that.
month. So
Yeah. So that's the
they're not
next
at
thing that I
2.
wanted to get into.
Yeah, if they're not at 2 and they're not at 2 for a while, why would they think about cutting now?
Right. So even to back up on why the Fed might cut at the moment, I wanted to also talk for a minute about what those numbers mean. So it's like you're like the Fed targets 2%. It was recently around 3%. So so whenever people are talking about inflation in the United States, so there's many ways of measuring inflation. So that's kind of a very big question in itself. Like with such a large country, any huge country with hundreds of millions of people that are, buying so many things every day, how do you know if inflation is 2.5% or 2.7%? Like how is that
Mm.
done? So in the United States, just again, so as a little bit of background, whenever people are typically throwing out these numbers, they're typically referring to the Consumer Price Index. So this is the CPI number that maybe you'll hear on TV or the radio when someone talks about the Fed or something like that, or they talk about inflation or price increases. They're typically talking about the uh, consumer price index. So this is a measure that is systematically done by the government each month. So it's through the Bureau of Labor Statistics. And so their whole intention, so on a monthly basis, they're trying to get an accurate measure of what inflation is. So they want to get, or so rather than just inflation, this is more general. It's just about the change of prices every month. So they want to get some measurement of it. And prices can rise or they can fall every month. When you've got broad rising in a consistent way over time, that's what we typically refer to as inflation. But when they talk about the CPI, that's what they're trying to do. Over a month to month period, they're trying to gauge how prices have changed compared to the last month. And then they give measures on a yearly basis, which are a little easier to quote and talk about. But anyway, so um, that's the main index that they have in the U.S. So there's a couple other as well that they have that are pretty well known. There's one called the Producer Price Index, or PPI, or the Personal Consumption Expenditure, which is the PCE index, which the Fed actually cares the most about. But to leave that aside for a minute, the one that's mostly cited is the CPI. So I just wanted to talk about like what is it and how do they do it. It's been moving around quite a bit recently. What's driving these things, and so certainly in a time when inflation is very high, this number is really scrutinized very closely to see, well, if the overall number is coming down, but what's the composition of that change? Or there's certain components of it that are coming down quicker than others that might be um, not quite as easy to keep that momentum going over time, which might impact policy decision making, that kind of thing. So broadly stated, so CPI, every month, the BLS distributes a number of surveys to the
DLS.
population. The Bureau of Labor
No, labor statistics. Okay,
Statistics,
BLS.
yeah, that's kind of admitted, does creates these surveys, calculates the metrics, and publishes them. So they distribute a bunch of these surveys to across many urban areas of the country. And so on the website, they say that of their surveys, they cover about 90% of the population. So it says this is the urban CPI, but they say that the pieces it doesn't cover is some like more like purely rural areas, or um, those not in major
Hmm.
metropolitan areas. That's only about 10%. So it's impossible to get a perfect metric, but so they say they cover about 90% of the population, and so they administer these surveys in a systematic way, and they come in many different formats. Like so some are simply going into grocery stores and just looking at the price on the shelves. So, that's a pretty reasonable thing to do. Others are household surveys. They can, like, some are phone administered. They've been moving a lot to online based things. I think there's even like some apps nowadays that they take information from to add into the final number. But they try their best to and then they ask business owners about what their costs are like and how those things are changing. Like,
Yeah.
what are the price differences in more abstract or like services
Yeah.
that have less price or transparent pricing around? It's like not just going to the store and buying a loaf of bread, but paying for some highly specialized, highly
Yeah. I guess I never
business
really.
service or something like that.
It's funny. I never really thought about. I never really thought about this, but that's a really good point. I mean, to try to summarize the entire nation of 300 plus million people with however many, I don't know, millions of grocery stores in all these different regions,
Right.
all these different products. The products are changing potentially every month. What goes into that basket, different region, and to just try to summarize that into a single number, you
Right.
must just leave it. Must be there must be a lot of, I don't know what the word is, assumptions, maybe just kind of like just sort of round, just for polishing of the edges here. Um,
Right.
that's a
And
really interesting
that's
point.
exactly
So
what
like
they need to do.
people today, I guess you see them complaining that, oh, if inflation's only like 3%, how come I still can't afford anything? That might be one of the answers. It's just, look, it's one number, but we're talking about hundreds of millions of goods, across, like, an economy that's trillions in size. So,
Right.
how can you
Yeah.
really
And so,
actively try to follow what, and it doesn't even include everything, right? Like you said,
mhm.
it's just, there's like core or something, CPI, and then there's
Yeah. So
the
like not
food
even
and
going into
stuff,
that
and
part
that's
yet.
different. Not even that part yet.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
yeah, so they, like some of the numbers I wrote down actually, so it's like 90% of the population or whatever, but it says roughly on average every month they survey across 75 urban areas in the country from about 6,000 households. So they try to randomize these things across approximately 22,000 retail establishments. So including like things like department stores, supermarkets, hospitals, gas stations, other types of stores and service
Yeah.
establishments. So they try to get as wide as possible. And one of the other things I saw, so just on the BLS website as I was reading the background, it also includes tax on these things, which I think is kind of interesting because they don't
Okay.
actually publish like a pre-tax version. So it just takes in, or it's that's any changes
That's
to fiscal
interesting.
policy are also baked in to these inflation numbers that we see. So there's not a
Right.
huge number of changes yet to the tax code that have happened over the past few years, but that could be a big
Yeah.
driver of
Someone
what
introduces
changes.
sales tax for the first time. I guess you would expect to see a bump in inflation. Something like
Right.
that
Well, yeah, if it gets tweaked in some
for the
way,
first
or
time.
if it gets cut, yeah, or something like that.
Very interesting.
Yeah, and so that's really the other main points that I wanted to talk about that you started touching on is that it's so like it's a very difficult process to kind of pin down what that
Yeah.
number is, and so you kind of have to ask yourself like, well, all right, well, what does this really mean to me now? It's like, okay, now we're at 3%, but this is across all spending groups across the entire country, across groceries and business services and and gasoline and electricity and all of these different things. And it means different things to different people. So they do their best, but they have to, like, at the end of the day, you need some standardized metric that everyone can,
Yeah.
kind of agree upon. Even if it's imperfect, it's the best we've got. So that's what you got to start with and at least understand what is there. As you started to say, it's like we've seen people have seen inflation come down recently, or just the number itself has come down recently. Uh, so what does that really mean? So like in June 2022, the headline CPI number it peaked the yearly rate not 9 point something percent, I think 9.1%, and since it's come down closer to 3%, and actually I believe the headline CPI that was just published a week or two ago for August 2024 was 2.5%. So it's come down quite a bit. So, and we're getting quite close to the Fed's 2% target. But if you're to ask the average person on the streets, you know, is inflation over? Like, if we beat inflation, it's back to, it's closer to 2% than 4% now. We're almost back to where it was. I think the pre-COVID average of the 21st century was, I think, maybe just below 2%. So we're very close. But I think the average person wouldn't agree that their pricing power, uh,
Yeah.
regardless of what kind of job you have, is much different than it was in the 2010s or in the early 2000s, for example. So that's the other difference in inflation when people talk about, we say this 9% or 3%, people are talking about the inflation rate. It's the change in prices. So whenever we say 2.5% just now, that's how prices have changed over the past year. So from August 2023 to August 2024, prices have increased by that much. In August 22, or I'm sorry, June 22, or whenever that number peaked around 9%, from that 1 year period, so from June 2021 till 22, prices had increased by, on average, roughly 9%. So the other thing is that you want to talk, or like you want to distinguish between the inflation rate and the inflation level. The inflation level is a little more abstract. That's not why it's quoted, but it's more concrete in that it's a more accurate measurement of what you're actually paying. So the
What do you
inflation
mean?
rate is how you're seeing things change.
Yeah.
The absolute level is so the level of prices versus the rate of change of prices.
Okay.
So
So
you pay a level of price,
what is the
and
inflation level then? Are there circles
yeah,
or something
so
that actually refer to this, or what is the
yeah, so
inflation
by
level?
that, so when I say inflation, like I really just mean price level.
Okay.
So if you say that that like
Okay.
2019 period, or sorry, 2022 period, if you're paying $100 for something in June 21, now for the exact same good, you're going to be paying $109 and nothing else has changed. Over the past year, if you were to instead look at 1 year ago, if you were paying $100 then, now you're going to pay $102.
Yep.
But the worst of inflation has already passed since then. So, and prices are already higher. So I think
Right.
a more accurate reference point would be basically COVID, or just ahead of
Pre-COVID.
COVID.
Just
Yeah.
so like yeah. So relative. Yeah. So that I think is a really key point. So kind of the answer to the question as to why do why do people still feel like they don't have a whole lot of purchasing power? How come
Right.
when I go to the supermarket, I want to get a week's worth of groceries or whatever, I'm still really stretching. And it
Hmm.
sounds like we touched upon a couple things. One is that that 3%, 2.5% number, or whatever that we're quoting for the inflation rate, is just some super wide abstract number that captures like everything. It doesn't only just capture what's happening in the grocery store, which could be a lot worse. The second thing is, well, your salary probably hasn't come up all that much. So your purchasing power has declined, even though inflation, quote unquote, over the year is still sort of at a more comfortable level of 2.5. But then the third point, and this is maybe the most critical of that, is that it's just the last year that prices have increased. Prices have gone up a huge amount in what was it, 2022? So over 2022, prices went up a lot, and then they didn't go back down. Just the inflation rate went down. So they kept growing. They just kept growing slower.
Exactly.
So that's why those kind of three reasons are why people are still feeling pain. This is not something that I guess, well, maybe I shouldn't go here, but like, politicians aren't going to highlight that unless they're against the current administration or something. Administration now is going to say
Right.
we got it back down to where our target is. When really it should be like we got it back down to you know, to what we should have been here, call it, if we had just, drew a 2% growth line in the inflation level, sort of the overall prices, which we are still well above,
Hmm.
if that makes sense.
Yeah, certainly. And so just from the um, just from the published data, so on the public website at the BLS, you can look this up, and they've got little calculators. You can index yourself in time. So the official number, based off of the official numbers that are published since January 2020, prices have increased 22%. So that headline
Oh, there
value
it
across
is. Okay.
everything is 22% as of,
Bam.
August 2024. And so just to go on that, it's that broad average a little more. So that number is composed of, so they break it up, I think, into five high levels. I don't have them written down at the moment, but, and they all get weighted to certain amounts into what
Mm-hmm.
that headline number is. So I think like rent and housing, for example, is nearly half of it.
Mm-hmm.
But then it's broken down further into things like energy, food, durable good, like clothing,
Yeah.
non-durable goods, things like that. And so whenever you start to peel back the pieces a little bit, so just a couple other numbers that I pulled, like one of the most important ones, so food, obviously. So looking at, so for both, and then so they split it further into like food at home or food away and things like that. Both of them actually are 26% higher as compared
Okay.
to January 2020. And I think rents are somewhere 25 or 26%
And then
as well.
what would it be if we had just kept along that 2% line? So we were 20% higher than,
Hmm.
where we than relative
Yeah, I
to
mean,
2020.
yeah, I mean, um, if we had 2% for 4 years, I mean, less than 10% total, something like that. Like, I think the rule of thumb is like when you have 2% inflation, prices will double every like 35 years. But if you had 10% inflation, they would double much quicker. I think what would be, I think like 6 or 7 years, things are going, prices are going to double at that rate. So when we should be paying something, you know, maybe 10% more, that like, probably 7 or 8% more that we would have seen from 2015 to 2019. Now we're seeing probably 3 to 4 times that price increase.
Yeah. So if it was just 2%, I guess for 4 years, 1.02 to the power four, you're at like, I guess 8.2%. Um, but now I just threw in some random numbers here: 2%, 9%, 5%, 2.5%. You're at 19.6%. So makes sense.
Right. So then, inflation has come down. So the rate of change, like you were saying, the rate of change decreased, or the level of prices decelerated. So prices are still increasing. They're just increasing less quickly. So people call that disinflation, not to be confused with deflation, which is
Disinflation.
prices
Got it.
themselves declining. Yeah. Um, so prices are still high, and incomes really haven't changed that much yet because people didn't want inflation to get worse. Well, like one of those things I was starting to touch on earlier. So people are like, at least personally, when I think about inflation, like I think about food. It's the one thing that is impossible to not spend more on, and it's over 25% more. And I would say, in certain metro areas, like over in
Yeah.
New York, it feels far higher. And you
Yeah.
can go on the website and drill down into individual items. It's actually very comprehensive what they publish.
What's the
But
website? That you're talking still about
uh,
the BLS? Just
yeah,
straight up.
just bls.org. Yeah, and then
Oh,
just go into
we'll
the
put it in
data
the show
releases.
notes. First time I've said that.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, yeah,
Put it
definitely.
in the notes. Do you want to see my worksheet? Put it in the notes.
Hmm.
Yeah, this
Yeah,
is all in the show notes. Yeah, why not? Fair.
definitely.
All right,
But
good stuff. That's interesting.
yeah. Hmm.
That's interesting. Yeah, it should be part of like kind of a running series. Kind of drill down into each one of those bits because I really didn't appreciate that. It's kind of obvious once you think about it, but
Hmm.
it's just one number. Just can't possibly
Right.
capture everything. So, and it sounded like you mentioned in there too that there were a couple kind of assumptions. Like if once you start including like weightings, you're almost talking
Hmm.
about more of a model than like a calculation.
Oh, that's certainly
Um,
what it is.
it's a model. Yeah, and
Hmm.
models are subject to all sorts of. You got to put in assumptions, and assumptions are wrong.
Right.
Assumptions,
It
by definition, are wrong. They are
right.
they
It's an
are the
assumption.
delta. It's the knowledge gap. Assumptions are just knowledge gaps. Um, Interesting. Okay,
Right,
that's
definitely.
interesting.
And there's flawed assumptions, there's flawed models, and one of the other things we can talk about another time maybe, but the BLS itself has had some issues with data quality and data dissemination and things like
Are they
this.
the ones that kept? Do they also do the employment numbers? Oh,
Yes,
is that?
which is
Okay. Yeah, you
totally
got to talk about
another.
this. Let's put some, I'll put some tinfoil on the wall here to make sure no one's listening in.
Right.
And then we can talk about what's really going on. Yeah, no,
Oh
but
yeah.
I'd be curious to hear, yeah, your take onto how they keeps going in one direction. I understand they kept been ratcheting down. So they would,
Hmm.
you know, correct me if I'm wrong, but they would like publish a number. They would say in June or whatever, we had an
Hmm.
additional 200,000 jobs or something. And then a month or two later,
Hmm.
they would say, oh, remember June? We said 200,000. Actually, it's like 100,000. And it keeps
Right.
going in one direction. So
Yeah,
that's,
so that's something that's done every month. They do a 2 month look back revision. So this is typical. And then they also do a every so I believe it's published in the summer, but they do a March to March full year revision as well. So these are standard things that they do. But by definition, these are random measurements. These are random variables. So you have some statistical distribution with which you would expect these revisions to follow. So
yeah,
something has been a little strange over the past few years is that every month they do keep getting revised downward month after month. So they're overestimating every month. At what point is this a statistical anomaly to a bias within the model itself?
yeah,
And so
yeah,
there's
exactly.
nothing, not even something
Sounds
nefarious
like,
about that. It's the
yeah,
model construction. It could be.
yeah, there's a natural back test built into the model. And at some point, you
Hmm.
gotta, if you keep seeing a pattern, at some point, you gotta roll that correction back into the model, which I guess they haven't done.
Right. And
Just,
so one of the biggest ones recently, so they just published their yearly revision. So
mm,
like March 23 to March 24, and they net revised down the number of jobs by I think it was over 800,000. I think it was something like 818,000 jobs. They said there's actually that many less net jobs that were created over the past 12 months. And so again, this is something
mm,
else that they do every year. It's standard, but I don't have the chart handy. But every year it kind of bounces up and down a little bit. Sometimes it's up, sometimes it's down. This one is strange because it's the largest downward revision since 2009. And so I think that's the other. So that's the depths of the Great Recession
interesting.
that year. So that makes a lot of sense. Things were really bad. Many jobs were being lost, and in fact, the number that were being lost was underestimated the whole time because it was, it could have been a very hectic time. Hiring and firing was happening very erratically. But if you were
Yeah.
to ask the average person, is this year as bad as 2009 in terms of the
So,
labor market?
sorry, are we talking just a clarifying point? I think I missed it, but you said that the this has been the largest adjustment downward since 2009, or this has been the largest drop in jobs since 2009's total. Is it the adjustment that's the biggest?
Adjustment.
The adjustment
Adjustment.
is the biggest since 2009. Okay, but overall, it's still net positive.
Yes, still net
Okay,
positive.
got it.
So, but the other thing is that with that net decline, and so I don't have the exact numbers, but before that happened, the other thing that's really that economists and politicians pay attention to. So obviously the monthly number of jobs that are being added, and that gets that can bounce around. So people look at like the 3 month average or the 12 month average, and so over like the last century, roughly, like a average number of jobs, new jobs each month, in a healthy growing economy is about 200,000. So before this
Okay,
revision,
seems like a lot.
there
Okay,
well, so that's like the long run average of a growing economy,
adding
or in the
200,000
United
jobs
States, right? Yeah, so that's just like the number that people see. So that's the number
seems
that
like a
people
lot.
index it around. Yeah, so
Okay,
it's like whenever the number comes out every month, if it's 270, that's pretty good. If it's 150, it's still adding a lot of jobs, but that's below
right.
average of a healthy growth rate. So with that big revision, before the revision, the 12-month average was somewhere in the, I think, somewhere in the 200s for sure. I think 230s or something, or maybe 240s. After the revision, it put it below 200 into like the 150s or so. So that's
So
it's
what? There are
it's like right
questions now
on that
coming out.
line.
Yeah,
Yeah,
question.
it's like if you were to interpret that number each month as we did, it looked like we're growing at a pretty healthy clip still. It's why the Fed could keep rates higher that they were right now because the job market looked much healthier. But
Mm.
in fact, on an average basis, that number was now over the past 12 months below, what you would call like a healthy growth rate. And again, this is just a statistical average. It's not gospel or anything, but it's just all of these numbers must be spoken about relative to previous ones. And so that's a material difference. So, we thought we had an above healthy growth rate when in fact, we were still growing, but it was weaker than you certainly would have wanted it to be. And
Got it.
so, the BLS is actually the same. Yeah, so this is the same government organization. They publish those labor statistics as well as the CPI index as well. So
Well,
there's
when's
also
the
some issues in the CPI that's happened.
yeah? We'll have to.
We can
Yeah,
talk
well, I
about
guess we can talk
sometime.
about that. Yeah, another. So you think they're going to cut? When's the actual? When's the date? It's like the 6th.
This Wednesday.
It's
Yeah, so
Wednesday.
FOMC
We're gonna let
meeting
them know if
this
this is going to be.
is this
Is it a big
Tuesday,
deal?
Wednesday, 2
Maybe.
p.m. We'll know.
All right, we on for Wednesday? Could talk about that.
Yes.
What that means. Um,
Wait a minute. No, sorry. I'm busy this Wednesday, but it's a one-off. But I
oh
could do
damn.
Tuesday or Thursday whenever you want.
Well, do you want to be on which side of the announcement do you want to be? This is potentially a huge one because it's not just an
Right.
FOMC announcement; it's an announcement before a change in posture, um,
Right.
which happens every year, couple years,
hmm
even like a decade for
Well,
that. So, what do you think? You want to be on which
yeah.
side
So
of
we can
that?
certainly get on and just be a little less like if we want to be before. That's only 2 days from now. Like you and I could certainly get on and just kind of
Well, let's
chat
do it. I
about
guess
it a little
after.
bit.
I guess this is the one before. Let's talk about
hmm
the after. Let's talk about it after and see what it means. Yeah, they'll cut it,
Okay.
and that means a whole bunch of things. We could talk about that. I could talk about it from like a bank perspective,
Right.
maybe like a personal finance perspective,
hmm
and you could talk
Yeah.
about
I
it
mean,
from
back to the
a
mortgage rates.
macroeconomic one. Yeah,
hmm
that's a big deal because after there's a lot of you would know this better than I do, but I understand that there's still already like a couple of cuts built into the current sort of bond rates, and you mentioned earlier that
Right.
yeah, probably mortgages are lower now because those are
hmm
pricing in the expectation that the Fed's going to cut. If they do cut, then should see rate like longer term rates fall um, because it's sort of they were right. The market predicted it, but now there's a confirmation, and whatever doubt was in the market would leave, and the rates would drop. Um, but
Which is kind of it. Which technically,
maybe
or
if it doesn't cut though, then it would go nuts, right? Then you would start to see. Well, you tell me a lot of uncertainty back
yeah,
because
yeah. There's
everyone was
this
so
weird.
sure, and they communicated. I
hmm
thought the Fed communicated pretty well that we're like, yeah, we're ready to
Yeah,
cut.
yeah. They've
And
they've they've telegraphed pretty
if they don't, then it's like, oh, you know, shoot, what's going on? I think we can
exactly. It would be
swear.
a
We can
big
swear on
upset
this
in
podcast, right?
expectations.
We can swear on this podcast. I think it's not for children. We can swear on this podcast. All right, maybe we'll bleep it out. All right. Hey, I wanted to mention actually
Instead
before
of
we
bleep it
wrap.
out, we'll do like a little change noise or something
Uh-huh.
like
I wanted to
like
mention too.
cash.
We're at the hour here, but you'll notice that like this. I don't know if you can see that the name, Trape. It's dumb.
hmm
So this is. I went ahead and got the subscription. Um, so
Okay.
now we're going to be at a higher quality video. Before it was like 720, and we shouldn't have any problem with how much we can record in a month. Whereas before it was
Okay.
just 2 hours. Now this should be five. It should be enough. We're at 1 hour now. So so that's cool. Um, I'll cover it for the first year. You can get next year.
No, no. I mean, definitely. Just tell me what it
Serious.
is. I'll
No, I'm
I'll split it
serious.
with you.
We are. Yeah, you'll get it next year. Um, so, but yeah, so that's exciting. And then I got these things set up. See the displays. So I was talking about. I don't know if
So
you can
I can't
expand.
actually see anything. I can only see like a very
You
tight
can
shot of just your
so
shoulders.
if you push the expand frame, I don't know what yours look like, but if you just click on like basically the middle of my face,
Oh, okay. Yeah, I see that now. Oh, yeah, I like that.
yeah, like
Well, I
that.
couldn't see it the whole time.
Yeah,
Now I
well, now I
can.
can.
Yeah, so then I guess whenever the final thing gets edited together and such, you have full control over like how to display those things or not, or
Yeah, I'm gonna try to figure that out. Basically, maybe not today, but maybe today.
right.
I'm
Yeah.
gonna try
Well,
to see because I think I know that you can in just the editing software you can either show like just you or just me or the shared screen and then our two screens or whatever, and then depending on that
hmm
you'll see more or less of the frame. The but like I know how I can establish that like at the beginning and do the entire recording, but there must be some way to just flip back and forth between like just showing you because like you were speaking for a
Right.
while. There's no reason for me to be on the screen. So we can just flip to you and you can hold this full camera for the 10 minutes or whatever that you spoke and I would be off. But then we need to flip back and so there's got to be a way to do
Hmm.
that. I'd like to be able to
Yeah,
do it
yeah.
here. Anyway, I'll figure that out. So good stuff. All right, well, I think that's wrapping up. This has been our first episode, I guess.
Episode one.
Yeah, episode one of the Root of All
One
Evil podcast.
1.0.
We are your hosts. I'm Luke, although it might say Trape down there, but that's just because we're on the. I'm gonna have to change that too. That's Joe.
And we are
Joe.
Trape.
Yeah, right. The Root of All Evil podcast. All right. I guess till next week.
Till
See you
next
later,
time.
Joe. Yeah.
See ya.
Stay healthy. Follow the markets. Got to come up with like some sort of sign off.
Yeah, sign off. Yeah.
All right.
Stay evil,
Yeah, and
everybody.
keep I don't know, watching the markets or whatever.
Yeah.
We'll figure it out. We'll
Ma-
figure something.
Smash that like button.
Yeah, right. No.
Yeah, not that one.
All right.
All right.
All right, cool.
Cool.
And I'll talk to you.
See ya.
Bye.